Okay, let's see what happens this time. Facebook is deciding whether or not we're going to go live. There we go. Okay, I'm going to give it just a couple of minutes for people to get back on, which it has been crazy. The last video, there we go. I started the live video a few minutes ago, and all of a sudden I look over and the videos froze up. And that's exactly what happened last week. All right, Tracy, Katrina are back on. All right, and ladies, can you hear me okay? So the video suddenly froze up, and I thought, okay, we're just going to stop it right here. I'm going to restart my machine again, which I did prior to getting on the Facebook Live to begin with. And so, and then there's Denise. As if that wasn't bad enough, just as I was about to go on the second time tonight, something happened down in the kitchen and the fire alarm started going off. Smoke alarm started going off. And I thought, oh my goodness, what in the world is happening down there? So hopefully we've got that one straightened out. And there we got a lot of people coming on. So sorry about the problems. For those of you who are on with me live, the video froze up a few minutes ago and came on at 7 o'clock, right on time. But the video suddenly froze up about 5 minutes into the video. So I decided to stop it right then and there, restart my computer again. And so here we are. All right. Are we ready? This is chapter 19. Genesis chapter 19 is where we're going to be. Again, I am teaching out of the Amplified Bible. And I love the Amplified Bible and would highly recommend it to anyone because it does not try to do a one-word for one-word translation. The Greek and Hebrew do not lend themselves very well to a one-word to one-word translation from Greek and Hebrew into English. Okay? So, let's pick it up with chapter 19. This is last week's part 4 ended with the Lord having come to Abraham. He had talked about going and seeing what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah because of the shrieking of the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. A lot of people don't realize in the spirit realm, sin shrieks. So when demonic spirits roam around seeking someone they can devour, that's how they figure out where to go. They are listening for the most shrieking that's going on in the spirit realm. And then they know they can get into that particular house or business or whatever. And so it makes a huge difference. That's how they do that. Okay? And so God says he was going to go down. He said, I'm going to see if it's as bad as what I'm hearing. And so that's when Abraham started negotiating with him and says, wait a minute. What if there are 50 righteous people there? And he says, the God that I know would not in any way destroy the righteous along with the unrighteous. And he bargained him down to 10 people. Now, keep it in mind, Sodom and Gomorrah were huge cities. We're talking probably the size of Columbus, Ohio, somewhere along in there. Okay? So here's we're picking up. He said it was evening in chapter 19, Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. He says, it was evening when the two angels came to Sodom. If you remember from the previous chapter, or part 4, there were two angels and then the angel of the Lord, which we believe was Jesus before he came to earth and laid all of his godly attributes down and became a man. Okay, so that he was the only one that could take away the sins of the world. So the two angels came to Sodom, and Lot was sitting at Sodom city gate. This was a normal thing for men to do at that point. They were looking for interesting people that might provide. They could provide hospitality for, and also could essentially provide some entertainment for the evening, having a guest, a brand new guest in the house. So because there were not hotels and motels and all that kind of stuff, and people would oftentimes sit at the city's gate and watch as newcomers would come in. And that's where they would sit. They would talk. The men would get together. They would talk about things, and kind of like used to see men sitting on the courthouse steps sometimes. And they had there's a small town where my grandfather used to live, and they had a couple of 3 or 4 rocking chairs, and several older men would always go up there and they would sit and they would talk over the cares of the world and that sort of thing. And so that's what that's what Lot was doing. He was sitting at the city's gate, and then he looked up and he noticed these two strangers coming, and seeing them, Lot rose up to meet them and bowed down to the ground. And he wanted to be the one that welcomed them to the city. He wanted to be the one that hosted them. So when new people would come to town, they would go to the town square, or they might go to, in a particular town, might be where the well was for that city, and it was the gathering place. And so people would come into that city, and they would go to that spot, and they would just stand there and wait until someone came over and invited them to come to their house. And so, when people were coming in to a new city like this, then you wanted to make sure that you had plenty of room for them. If they had animals, if they had, camels, donkeys, whatever, and cargo, you wanted to make sure that you had enough room for all of them. Okay? And so, but here, this time, there were just 2 men. And so Lot rose up to meet them, and he bowed down to the ground, and he said, "My lords, turn aside, I beg of you, into your servant's house, and spend the night and bathe your feet." This was a customary greeting. And he says, "Then you can rise early and go on your way." But they said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." And Lot's like, "No, no." And he entreated them and urged them greatly until they yielded, and with him entered his house. And he made them a dinner with drinking, and had unleavened bread which he had baked, and they ate. So he had no idea that he was entertaining angels. A lot of people, let me just intersperse this, a lot of people believe that angels don't eat. And there are several places in the Bible, and this being one of them, that proves that that's not true. These angels were eating. They were drinking. They were doing the normal things that you would expect a house guest to do. Okay? And so he says, but before they laid down, the men of Sodom, the men of the city of Sodom, both young and old, all the men from every quarter surrounded the house. And word of these 2 guys went all through the town, and these men suddenly surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may be intimate with them." I was like, wow. Well, if you ever wondered where we got the word sodomy, it was because of Sodom. And it was because of the actions of the men in that city and what they were known for. So homosexuality also was one of the main reasons why they were destroyed, but actually it wasn't the only reason. And I'll just pop this in here for you if you don't mind. Ezekiel 16:49. It says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom: pride, overabundance of food, prosperous ease, and idleness were hers and her daughters." What he's talking about, her and her daughters, were the other cities that were in that, and smaller towns that were in that area. You know, so like here in Ohio, we have Columbus, Ohio, and that is the main city. But then you also have Worthington and Dublin and Reynoldsburg, you know, that sort of thing. Those are cities of themselves that have all run together. And those of us who don't live in Columbus think of just the whole thing being Columbus, Ohio. But in reality, it's not. It is a city with other cities that have grown together into one big metropolitan area. And so he says that that's the reason he said that her and her daughters. So he says that, behold, Ezekiel 16:49, "Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom: pride." They did have a lot of pride, overabundance of food. One of the other Bible verses said that the area of Sodom and Gomorrah was like the Garden of Eden. It was absolutely amazing. So when Abraham and Lot, if you remember, they got too big. They were too rich, too wealthy. Oh, excuse me. Goodness. Suddenly came on me. And they were too prosperous, they were very prosperous and too wealthy to be together. So Abram says, "Okay, look, you've got a lot of herds and cattle and all this kind of stuff, and Abraham did too." He says, "We are too big to be living together." Then he says, "You decide." He told Lot, he said, "You decide which way you're going to go. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right." Okay? And so Lot looked towards the area of Sodom and Gomorrah and thought they were absolutely spectacular. And he thought, I'd rather go live in the city. I'm kind of tired of living in a tent, so I'm going to go live in the city. And that's what he did. He and his whole group. He had an abundance of people that worked for him: men servants, maid servants, men slaves, women slaves, herds, all kinds of stuff. So Sodom, though, was an area that had a superabundance of everything, seems like. And so that's why Ezekiel said pride was a big part of their problem. Overabundance of food, prosperous ease, which means they had a lot of time on their hands. And then it says, "And idleness was hers and her daughters. And neither," and this was the other thing, "neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." And said they were kind of hard-hearted towards the poor and the needy. They had all the food they wanted. They didn't really have to work hard for anything, and had all this time on their hands. And then that's when Satan was able to get them over into areas that they should not have gone into, and homosexuality being one of them. So homosexuality was one of the reasons they were destroyed, but also pride, overabundance of food, prosperous ease, and idleness, and not helping the poor. And then he also says in verse 50, he says, "And they were haughty and committed abominable offenses before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it, and I saw fit." So that's what he was telling Abraham. He says, "Look, the shrieks of Sodom and Gomorrah have come up to me, and I've come down to see if it's as bad as what I'm hearing." So then here, these two angels are with Lot in his house, and they're surrounded by the men of the town. And they want to have relations with these two men. and not realizing that these two men were angels and were about to destroy the whole place. And so Genesis 19:6, he says, and Lot went out of the door to the men and shut the door after him. And so these guys surrounded the house. They called out to him, and Lot's like, no. And he goes out on the porch and shuts the door behind him. And because of, during that time, according to Oriental custom, a host was responsible for protecting his guests from harm, whatever the cost. It didn't matter. And so that's why he says to these men, he says, I beg of you, my brothers, do not behave so wickedly. And he says, look now, I have 2 daughters who are virgins. Let me, I beg of you, bring them out to you, and you can do as you please with them. But only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Back then, protecting your guests was absolutely paramount. And of course, it also speaks to how they felt, how women were lower on the totem pole, I guess is kind of one way to say it. And when you read about this, we are absolutely flabbergasted that he would do such a thing. We wouldn't even dream of doing such a thing like that, offering our daughters to people to violate because of a couple of people who came to stay with us. Of course, we'd be calling the cops. But it was just amazing. But that Oriental custom, a host was to protect his guests, whatever the cost, and that's the reason he did what he did. Now, I'm certainly not condoning what he did by any stretch of the imagination, but just letting you know that's what happened. But they said, "Hey, Lot, stand back," and they said, this fellow came in to live here temporarily. So here they're talking amongst themselves, and they're telling him, hey, you step back out of the way. And another guy says, this fellow came here, and he's talking about Lot. This fellow came here to live temporarily, and now he presumes to be our judge? And he says, he looks at him and says, now, we're going to deal worse with you than we are with them. So they rushed out and pressed violently against Lot and came close to breaking down the door. And Lot is trying to stand in their way. But then the men, or the angels, reached out, grabbed Lot, pulled him into the house, and shut the door after him. And then they struck the men who were at the door of the house with blindness. They dazzled them somehow with blindness, from the youth to the old men, so that they wearied themselves groping to find the door. They couldn't see. And they're groping around and can't find the door. And all these men that have surrounded this house are just wandering around aimlessly because they can't see anymore. And so the 2 men asked Lot, he says, have you any others here? Son-in-laws or sons or your daughters? And whoever you have in the city, bring them out of this place. For we will spoil and destroy Sodom. For the outcry and shriek, get this, for the outcry and shriek against its people has grown great before the Lord, and he has sent us to destroy it. It just doesn't get any plainer than that. I bet Lot's jaw just dropped. Could not believe what he was hearing. So these guys are all still wandering around. These men of the city are still kind of groping around because they still can't see. So that allowed Lot to get out, and the 2 girls, the 2 daughters, did have, they were betrothed. And there were, essentially at that point, son-in-laws. They weren't officially married yet, but a betrothal was very strong back in those days. And so he went out and he found those guys and his son-in-laws, and who were, he said, well, okay. He says in verse 14, and Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, up, get out of this place, for the Lord will spoil and destroy this city. But it seemed to his sons-in-law to be only joking. They thought he was making a joke at their expense, and they just laughed. So Lot went back to the house. When morning came, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and 2 daughters who are here, and be off, lest you too be consumed and swept away in the iniquity and punishment of the city. They're trying to urge them to go, that this is about to happen. And they said, look, if you don't get up out of here, you're going to be caught up in this stuff. And so, but they still lingered. They had a lot of stuff. He was a very wealthy man. And again, he had all kinds of employees. He had all kinds of herds. He had all kinds of possessions. It wasn't, he wasn't a poor person by any stretch of the imagination. And so he lingered. And the men seized him. They grabbed him, they grabbed the wife, they grabbed the 2 daughters by the hand, and they literally marched them out of the city. And he says, for the Lord was merciful to him. And they brought them forth and set them outside the city and left them there. What about all of Lot's employees? They didn't make it. Those that were in that whole area were destroyed. Lot was about to lose everything. Absolutely everything. And he and the wife and the 2 daughters just couldn't believe it. It's like, wow, what do we take with us? How do we pack? How do we do this? And finally, the angels was like, you don't. And you've got enough. And took them by the hand and took them outside. And then when they had brought them forth, they told them, escape for your life. Do not look behind you or stop anywhere in the whole valley. Escape to the mountains of Moab, lest you be consumed. So there he was telling him, this entire valley of Moab is going to be completely destroyed. Get yourself to the mountains. And it's like, Lot looked at him and he said to them, oh, not that, my lords. It's like, what? He didn't want to go to the mountains. He liked the life in the city. And he says, behold now, your servant has found favor in your sight. In most places in the Bible, they would say, if your servant has found favor in your sight. No, he says, no, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight. And you have magnified your kindness and mercy to me in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest the evil overtake me and I die. It's like, wow. He says, now, see yonder city? It's near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. He says, oh, let me escape to it. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. He said, there's that little town. I don't want to go to the mountains. I'm not a mountain man. I'm not one that likes to camp. I'm a city dweller. I'm an urbanite. He says, that city over there, which is called Zoar, he said, it's a little one. He says, look, isn't that a little one? And he says, I can go there and my life will be saved. And the angel said to him, see, I have yielded to your entreaty concerning this thing also. I will not destroy this city of which you've spoken, but make haste and take refuge there. for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar, which means little. Like he said, it's a little city, right? It's little. It's not going to take up much room. You don't have to destroy that one. The people of Zoar have no idea what's happening right now and how close they came to destruction, because the angels were intending to wipe everything in that valley out. All of that whole Moab area. They were going to wipe it off the face of the earth. But that little town of Zoar, because Lot didn't want to go camping in the mountains, then he saved all those people's lives. So then the Lord, he said, the sun had risen over the earth. Lot and his daughters and his wife, they start heading towards Zoar. And it says the sun had risen over the earth when Lot entered Zoar. And then the Lord rained on Sodom and on Gomorrah brimstone and fire from out of the heavens. He overthrew, destroyed, and ended those cities. Not just a little bit. He ended those cities. And all the valley, all the inhabitants of the cities, which also meant all of Lot's former employees and slaves and everything that he owned, absolutely obliterated. And so he says he overthrew, destroyed, and ended those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground, all the crops, everything, the abundance of that whole area. It said, the word says that it was like Eden. It was so fertile. It was so beautiful, so lush. All of it was destroyed. But Lot's wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Sodom Gomorrah not only was absolutely destroyed, but it's thought to be covered by the Dead Sea today. That's why we don't know exactly where these cities or this valley was. God made sure they would never be revived. So today, they're underwater on the western part of the Dead Sea. So that's what, people, theologians are wondering. Did Lot's wife immediately turn to a pillar of salt? Or did she die right there and right where she stood and became petrified to a certain extent? And then as the waters came over her, as the Dead Sea expanded into that whole valley, the crustaceans and everything. If you look at a movie about the under the sea, and you see all the little animals and everything that encrust on everybody, all the on everything that's there, covers it in urchins and sea urchins and stuff like that. So some of the theologians are wondering, is that really what happened? But we don't know. The word says that she turned into a pillar of salt, and that's what we're going to go with. Okay? And so here, Abraham, then, Zoar, or Lot and his two daughters are now in Zoar. Abraham went up early the next morning to the place where he, only the day before, had stood before the Lord. He was the one that he was standing in the same place where he was bargaining with the Lord, said, Lord, you can't destroy these cities. I can't believe that you would destroy the righteous. Well, no, he didn't. So it's like I mentioned before, the when Noah's flood, God waited until the very last righteous person on earth, that was Noah, before he destroyed the rest of the world. He saved Noah and the rest of the world. Now, in this particular case, he didn't wait that long. And he waited, though, until the last righteous person in Sodom and Gomorrah, and absolutely destroyed the place. Leveled the whole valley of Moab. And so he got up, and early in the next morning, he looks toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of that country went up like the smoke of a furnace. Smoke was just billowing everywhere. And he's standing there, and he's like, wow. When God, in verse 29, says, when God ravaged and destroyed the cities of the plain of Sodom, he earnestly remembered Abraham, imprinted and fixed him indelibly on his mind. And that's the reason he sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities where Lot lived. It was because of Abraham that God sent angels to drag Lot and his family out of there before they destroyed the whole place. So Lot is in Zoar for the night, and I am certain nobody got any sleep that night because of the absolute destruction that was going on, the brimstone, the fire, everything that was hitting. Now, could very well have been a meteor, meteor clusters that were coming, and is what they referred to as brimstone. Could be that that was what was falling from the sky and literally just destroyed the whole place. And while all of this is going on, horrendous noise, horrendous, I guarantee nobody got any sleep that night. And Lot's looking at all of this and thinking, wow, these people are going to blame me for this. So Lot and his daughters slipped up out of Zoar, and they dwelt in the mountain, the exact place where he did not want to go in the first place. And because he did not want to go camping in the mountains, Zoar was saved. But of course, the people of Zoar, man, made it, they survived by a sliver. And who knows that whether they would have blamed Lot if they'd found out or not. And so Lot went up out of Zoar, dwelt in the mountain, and his two daughters with him. They had provisions with them, and so he says, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. And that's the reason I said he was afraid they were going to blame him, and that he was going to get killed if they found out he had just left Sodom Gomorrah, and they were the only ones that were left alive. And so he said he feared to dwell in Zoar. So he lived in a cave, he and his two daughters. And then the elder said to the younger, our father's aging. One of the reasons why Lot says, I can't go to the mountains is also because he's not a spring chicken anymore. Father's aging. And then, so the eldest daughter said to the youngest, our father is aging, and there is not a man on earth to live with us in the customary way. Well, they just left men that were in Zoar, so they were betrothed to be married and had just lost their future husbands. They knew there were other men on the earth, but not men that were following the God of Abraham. Not men from their group, their tribe, there weren't any left. And so the older one says to the younger one in verse 32, come, let's make our father drunk with wine. So apparently they had enough wine to get the party started. And we will lie with him so that we may preserve offspring, or our race through our father. And so they made Lot drunk. He was feeling bad enough about what was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah and all the things, and literally they had lost everything. He was a wealthy man at the beginning of that week, and by the end of the week, he was homeless, living in a cave with his two daughters. And so I would imagine it didn't take a whole lot of convincing for him to get drunk. And that's exactly what happened. So they made their father drunk with wine that night, and the older went in and lay with the father, and he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she arose. Now, never having been drunk before, have no experience in this area. Not about to have any experience in this area. But it just seems to me, how in the world did they get him so drunk that she could have sex with him and get pregnant with him, by him, and him not even know she had been there? I don't know. That kind of perplexes me. And not only one time, however, the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, "See here, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drunk with wine tonight also, and then you go in and you lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring, or our race, through our father." They were very certain that it would only take one time and they would both be pregnant. Well, they were right. Thus, both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father, and he never knew that they had slept with him. That he didn't know when they came to bed with him. They didn't know. He didn't know when they got up. And I'm thinking, okay, was it drunk combined with deep depression that he didn't even realize what happened? And then all of a sudden, you can imagine the shock when all of a sudden he looks and they're living in this cave, and suddenly she looks pregnant. And she looks pregnant too. And come to find out, yeah, well, who's the father? You are. When did this happen? After Sodom and Gomorrah. Wow. So the older son, or the older daughter, bore a son, named him Moab, which means of a father. Wow, isn't that kind of... How would you like to be reminded of that? Every time you look at this child, you would be reminded that you got your father drunk and you seduced him, and so you named the kid Moab. And he is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger one also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami, son of my people. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So not only was Sodom and Gomorrah nothing but a blazing ruins, but also Admah and Zeboim, they were all, those were destroyed. All the towns in the valley of Sodom were destroyed. Zoar was the lone exception. It was the only exception. It's like, wow. Meanwhile, chapter 20, back to Abraham. Abraham journeyed from there. He decided, because he had so much wealth, he had so much going on, that he wound up moving from place to place, because his animals would eat all the food that were in all the pasture in that area. So every so often they'd have to pack everything up, and they moved. And so he journeyed from there towards the south country of the Negeb, which he had been in that area before, and he dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he lived temporarily in Gerar. So here they wound up camping between Kadesh and Shur, but Abraham went into the city of Gerar, and that's where he and Sarah lived. Well, guess what happened? Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, heard about Sarah. Here it is again. He heard about Sarah, and he took her and put her in his harem. Now, does that sound familiar? Yeah. Gerar was in the Philistia. It was he was Abimelech was the Philistine king, okay, named Abimelech. Now, that was in Philistia. Now, the last time Sarah was taken by a king was in Egypt, back in Genesis chapter 12. Now, that king heard from his sons, the princes, and said, "You ought to see this woman that came in through the gates today. Absolutely gorgeous." They didn't know she was 65 years old. She was 65, approximately 65 at that time. Okay? And he took her and took her into his harem. Well, this time, Abimelech did the same thing. He heard about her and had his boys go get her, had the troops go get her and bring her to him, and put her in his harem. What's the difference? Well, the difference is now she's 79 years old. She's not 65 anymore. She's 79 approximately. And God has blessed her so much. It's like 79 years old and so beautiful that two kings took her away from her husband and put her in their harem. And I always ask people, do you know any 79-year-olds that are harem material? How about any 65-year-olds that are harem material? No, normally you're thinking, 16, 17, 19, 20, they all, back in that day, you were considered a woman and marriageable at age 13. It's like, wow, yeah, we wouldn't, we don't dream about that today, okay? We wouldn't, so in any case, they married early, and those are the ones that would normally be taken into the harem, okay? Not a 65-year-old, and certainly not a 79-year-old. But God, she was there for a while, okay? Now, if you just read the word here, it goes from chapter 20, verse 2 to chapter 20, verse 3, and says, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, Behold, you're a dead man, because of the woman you have taken as your own, for she is a man's wife." Now, that's just one verse away, okay? They come into town, Abimelech finds out about her, takes her away, puts her in his harem, and then the very next verse, then God spoke up to Abimelech and told him, "You're a dead man." Well, what you don't understand is there is a period of time between these two verses. Okay? Here, I'll show you. Let's go on. He says, but Abimelech had not come near her, so he says, Lord, so he's in this dream. He says, Lord, will you slay a people who are just and innocent? Did not the man tell me she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. He's like, in the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands, I've done this. He says, I don't know. All I can do is go on what they tell me. He said she's my sister. She said he's my brother. It's like, wow. And then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. For it was I who kept you back and spared you from sinning against me. Wow. Now you would think he would be saying, I kept you from sinning against Sarah. No, he said, I kept you back and spared you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not give you occasion to touch her. So he says now, restore to the man, his wife, for he is a prophet. This is, as far as I know, the first time that I recall that Abraham has ever been called a prophet. So God told him, restore to the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not restore her to him, know that you will surely die, you and all who are yours. So now he had a choice. God stopped him from touching her. Now he has told him the situation, and now he's given him a choice. You can go ahead and have her if you want, but if you do, I'm killing you and everybody that's yours. This whole place will be a ghost town. And so Abimelech rose early that morning, called all of his servants, and told them the things that he had seen in the dream. And the men were exceedingly filled with reverence and fear. And so, these are people who have never met God before. And that was part of the problem. Abraham thought, they'll have no reverence for God. There's no way that they can, that they will, have reverence for a God that they've never had anything to do with. So Abimelech called Abraham and called him in. So that took a little while the guards to go get him and bring him in. And he looks at him and says, "What have you done to us?" He says, "How have I offended you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me what ought not to be done to anyone." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see in us that justified you in doing such a thing as this?" He was perplexed. And Abraham said, "Because I thought surely there is no reverence or fear of God at all in this place, and they will slay me because of my wife." So it was customary. I covered this in chapter 12, but I'll hit it again here. It was customary at that point that you were forbidden to take a man's wife away from him. So what did they do? When they found a woman they really liked, and she happened to be married, well, bump the man off, okay? Kill her husband, and suddenly, oh, look, she's not married anymore, so we can take her. And that's exactly what that was the common thing in those days. And so Abraham didn't want that to happen. And so he says, "I thought surely there was no reverence or fear of God at all in this place, and they will slay me because of my wife." He says, "But I didn't lie to you." He said, "But truly, she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not of my mother. And she became my wife." So he says, "We didn't lie to you. We just didn't tell you everything." Okay? She is my sister. I am her brother. We have the same dad, but different mothers. It's like, wow. And so that was very common back in those days. Very common. And so he said, and she became my wife. So he says, "When God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her," this is what he told her. And this is what he's admitting now. Now, we haven't heard him say this before, but he's saying that when we took off from Ur of the Chaldees, where we originally lived, and we left there, and when I left my father's house, he said, I said to her, "This kindness you can show me. At every place we stop, say of me, he is my brother." So that's what she was doing. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves, and gave them to Abraham, and restored to him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, the whole land, my whole land is before you. Live anywhere you want. Dwell wherever it pleases you. So now, back in chapter 12, when the Egyptian did the same thing, the Egyptian king did the same thing, he told his soldiers, he says, you escort him and everything he has out of this place, and you make sure he moves on. Well, Abimelech is like, hey, my whole land is here. You live wherever you want to live, and dwell wherever it pleases you. And then in verse 16, he said to Sarah, he said, Behold, he says, I have given to this brother of yours 1,000 pieces of silver. And see, it is to compensate you. It is to compensate you for all that has occurred. And he says, to vindicate your honor before all who are with you. Before all men, you are cleared and compensated. Okay? Now, what you don't see here, okay, wait a minute, one more verse. He says, so Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his female slaves. And they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast the wombs of all in Abimelech's household because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. That's why I said, in if you just read it the way it reads, it looks like in verse 2 here in chapter 20, verse 2. Well, Abraham said to his wife Sarah, she is my sister, and Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah into his harem. And the very next verse, but God came to Abimelech. No. You get down to verse 18 and you find out that was months and months in between those two verses. How long would it take for them to notice none of the women are getting pregnant? And it's not because the men aren't trying. None of the women are getting pregnant. It would take them months and months to find that out. And to realize none of the women are getting pregnant. And they were all wondering why. What happened? Then all of a sudden, Abimelech has this dream, and God comes to him in verse 3 and says, you're a dead man. And we find out in verse 18, he had closed all the wombs of the women, so they couldn't get pregnant. It's like, wow. God, you're amazing. Absolutely amazing. And so he goes on. Let's see, how much time do we... okay, a little bit more. Let's do chapter 21, okay? And he says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. What did he tell her? He told her that, he says, when he was dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? And he told her, I will come to you this time next year. Okay? Now, that also tells us that it has been a year since Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's why I said it took a lot of time for Abimelech and those guys to figure out none of the women are getting pregnant. So here the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for her as he promised. She became pregnant. She is 80 years old and pregnant. And she bore Abraham a son in his old age. He is 90. And it was at the set time God had told him. Verse 2 says, at the set time God had told him. So it was now a year since Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham named his son, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Laughter. Why? Because she had laughed when the Lord said, you're going to have an heir by your wife, not by Hagar. It's like, oh, and she's laughing. She's like, I am well past the age of childbearing and I've never had a child. I'm in my late 70s already. And she laughed and she's like, am I to enjoy pleasure with my Lord Abraham again and him also being advanced in age? And she laughed. And she's like, that is totally unheard of. And the Lord spoke and says, is anything too hard for the Lord? Oh, and she says, I'm sorry, I didn't laugh. And he says, you did laugh. And you're going to name your son Isaac Laughter, because I'm going to remind you about it every time you call him Isaac. You're going to realize laughter. And so she bore him Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as the Lord had commanded him a year before. Okay, and so now it says Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. 100 years old. Isn't that amazing? And said that, oh, I guess I told you wrong earlier, didn't I? She was not 79 years old. She was 89 years old. I got my math mixed up. And I apologize about that. And so, because that was just a year since Sodom and Gomorrah. And it says here that he's 100 years old when Isaac was born. And so Sarah said, God has made me to laugh. All who hear will laugh with me. And it's like, that's your son? Can you hear these folks? That's your son? Yeah. You're 90 years old. Yeah. Isn't it funny? Isn't it funny that a woman 90 years old would have a baby? And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children at the breast? She said, who had ever thought such a thing would happen? That a 90-year-old woman would be able to nurse a baby at her breast. She says, for I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the day that Isaac was weaned. Now keep in mind, they didn't have formula back then. They didn't have any of that stuff. Okay, so if a woman didn't have enough milk, then they had to bring in another woman that did have enough milk to be able to feed the baby. Okay, they had, of course, they could also do goat's milk and stuff like that if no one else had just had a baby. And so then it says Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking Isaac. Oh, that did not sit well. When she saw Ishmael mocking Isaac, at this point Isaac would probably be somewhere in his mid-teens, okay? And he's mocking this little boy. Sarah was livid. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne him, mocking her son Isaac. Therefore she went to Abraham, and she told him, you cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. It was her idea in the first place. Yeah. Okay. But that didn't matter at this point, did it? She was furious. And the thing was very grievous, serious, evil in Abraham's sight on account of his son Ishmael. He had This was his son by Hagar, and he loved that boy. And here now his main wife is saying, you gotta take her and the boy and cast him out. And he's like, no, no, I will not do such an evil thing. He was such a wealthy man. It's like, no, not doing it. God came to Abraham and he said to him, he says, don't let it seem grievous and evil to you because of the youth and your bondwoman. Now keep in mind one thing I mentioned back in when Hagar first got pregnant. If Abraham were to look at Isaac or Ishmael and say, you are my son, that's all it would take. That if he publicly said, you are my son, then he would be the heir. He would be one of the heirs, I should say. He would be right there, right along with Isaac. God told him, he says, don't let this be grievous to you. Don't let it, he says, do not let it seem grievous or evil to you because of the youth and your bondwoman. In all that Sarah has said to you, do what she asks. For in Isaac shall your posterity be called. So God is saying, yeah, I know it sounds grievous and you love the boy. And you would never do this on your own. But do as she asks. God is going to make sure that Abraham's posterity was going to be through Isaac, not Isaac and Ishmael. They were not going to share the posterity. Okay? But he says, I will make a nation of the son of the bondwoman also, because he is your offspring. It's like, okay. So, he had his orders, and like he has always done so far, when God told him to do something, he got right on it. Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulders, and sent her and the youth away. I just cannot imagine how sad he was at that point. To do this, to send the boy away. You know, and Hagar was, she was still a bondwoman and a secondary wife to him. And he gets up. They knew, that Sarah was livid with Ishmael. They thought, well, Abraham will protect us. Get up the next morning, and all of a sudden, here he is. He says, hey, come on, pack your stuff. And it was like, what? And he gave him bread, bottle of water, gave him to Hagar, put him on her shoulders, and sent her away. And she wandered on aimlessly and lost her way in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the bottle was all gone, Hagar caused the youth, Ishmael, she caused her son Ishmael to lie down under one of the shrubs. Then she went and she sat opposite him a good way off, about a bow shot, he says. For she said, let me not see the death of the lad. She didn't want to watch her son die out in the heat. They had no more water. And she thought, we don't know where we are. This is a horribly huge desert area. We're going to die. And I don't want to watch my son die. And she sat down opposite him. And he lifted up his voice. And he wept. And she raised her voice and wept. God heard the voice of the youth, Ishmael, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the youth where he is. Arise, raise up the youth and support him with your hand, for I intend to make a great nation of him. Wow, going to make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. She did not realize they were right by a well of water. God opened her eyes and she saw the well of water. God bound to have kept her from seeing it up to that point until she was desperate enough to cry out to God. And she did, and he did. And she went and filled the empty water bottle with water and caused the youth to drink. And the Lord was with the youth, and he developed. And he dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took a wife for him out of the land of Egypt. Now, she came from Egypt. So, she apparently went back to Egypt, or came across this woman who was Egyptian, and she took her as a wife for Ishmael. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. It's like, yeah. So now swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my son or my posterity. This is the same Abimelech that had taken Sarah. Okay? And so he goes back to Abraham and says, you swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me and my son or with my posterity. But as I have dealt with you kindly, you will do the same with me and with the land in which you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. When Abraham complained to and reasoned with Abimelech about a well of water, Abimelech's servants had violently seized. And Abimelech said, I don't know. He says, I know not who did this thing. You did not tell me, and I did not hear of it until today. So they had a squabble. Abimelech's men came in and took a well that Abraham's men had dug, and Abraham went. He did what he said he was going to do. He could have just slaughtered those guys. You know, he had a small army himself. But he went to Abimelech, and Abimelech said, this is the first I'm hearing of this. So Abraham took sheep and oxen, gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a league or covenant. Abraham split apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what do these 7 ewe lambs which you have set apart mean? Now, literally, he had cut them down the middle like he did when he and God made a covenant. Okay, and so he asked him, what do these mean? And he says, you are to accept these 7 ewe lambs from me as a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, this place was called Beersheba, well of the oath, because there both parties swore an oath. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham sojourned in Philistia many days. I think that's probably a good place to stop. This is, it's amazing all the things that God has done with Abraham. And I hope that you have enjoyed, this is part 5. I hope that you've enjoyed the other parts as well. God gave Abraham a lot of real estate in the Bible. And there's more, actually. But I'm thinking, okay, part 5 probably might be enough. But if you guys want me to go on to part 6, I can. Just have to let me know that, okay? So as of now, I'll plan on not going any further, just simply because we've got over 5 hours talking about Abraham here. All right. Any questions at the moment? So glad for those of you who joined me live. There's a whole group of you, and I appreciate it. Those of you who are joining me in an archive, thank you so much. And I'm asking that you share the videos, share the Bible seed, invite your friends to join the seed, and there's so much that we can wind up learning. And there's so much more. We will never know it all by any stretch of the imagination. And I tell people, I don't think that I know everything because I know good and well I am just scratching the surface. And so, but I thank God that He uses me to teach His Word. All right. You guys have a good night. Thank you for joining me. Share the video, and I'll see you next week, if not sooner. Good night.